Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, and this is my 2000th video made over the course of the past 2.5 years. And I'm just sort of astonished to be sitting here talking to you, because I don't remember making 2,000 videos. They sort of just happened spontaneously because of the COVID crisis. And all I can say is I want to thank all of you so much for coming with me on this journey and giving me an audience and an opportunity to talk to you about the topic I love most of all, which is, of course, classical music, or music generally. I mean, anything musical. It's been quite a journey. And the idea for this particular video came to me from one of you, as so many of these do, because this has been a real give and take relationship. A wonderful relationship. You suggested to do a chat on reputations based on the fact that I mentioned that Sviatoslav Richter's reputation doesn't seem to be what it was, but on the other hand, Glenn Gould is still going strong. And I think that's an excellent suggestion. Thank you very much. I probably wouldn't have come up with it on my own, at least anytime soon. So let's do a little talk about that. And let's start with Richter and Gould. What is the difference between the two of them? Well, in my view, what I think the difference is, first of all, Richter made scads and scads and scads of recording, but he was completely averse to publicity. And that tells, because he's relying on his labels to promote them, and no label has a real monopoly on his work. I mean, Universal sort of has the most of it, but he recorded for, if you take the Universal labels separately, Philips, Deutsche Grammophon, Decca, EMI, which is now Warner, Eurodisc, which is now BMG, Melodia. I mean, he was all over the place. He's on Supraphon. He had no loyalties. And because he had no loyalties, he wasn't promoted. Glenn Gould was a Sony artist from day one, basically. And that label was behind him from the very, very start. But beyond that, Gould was a controversial but public character. He stopped giving live concerts. Richter would give concerts in a bathroom if there was a piano there. They were both very quirky and individualistic, but Gould's quirks were more marketable than Richter's quirks. Richter's quirks were kind of antisocial. Gould's were more, he had his radio show in Canada. He liked to publicize his quirks, number two. But number three, I think the most important difference between the two of them, if I'm thinking about it, is that there's value in scarcity, and Richter played lots of everything, and Gould played the Goldberg variations. Yes, he did all of the rest of Bach, and he did Beethoven and Mozart and, other people. But he was famous for one recording, the Goldberg variations, which he made twice. And that recording has been ceaselessly flogged since 1955. He is completely and entirely identified with that one single work, and that work happens to be by Bach, the Bach. Whereas Richter, sure, he did the Well-Tempered Clavier and other Bach. But he also did tons of other stuff. And he was never identified with a single piece of music the way Glenn Gould was. Later in his career, Richter had some, identification with like Schubert, for example, but that wasn't the same because Schubert was never as popular as Bach. He wasn't Bach. You know what I mean? So for those three reasons, I think Gould has sustained his reputation because it's easy to market one identifiable thing than it is to market an entire career by someone who didn't really care about it. And that really is the difference. But we can talk about other groups too, and we'll see along the way what happened to their reputations and how they were sustained by the recording industry. Because remember, the only thing that sustains a reputation is records. Before that, there were no reputations. There's just historical figures, right? Hans von Bülow, the great conductor, is a historical figure. But most people have never heard of him, and more importantly, no one has heard him. So it really doesn't make any difference. But, people who live to make records can have a recorded legacy, and that legacy could be evaluated and potentially sold or kept before the public. Now, let's talk about, for a moment, I've got little examples of everything here, chamber music groups. Now, there's a group whose reputations are completely fungible. They come, they go, no one cares. Probably the best known of all chamber music groups is the Juilliard Quartet, because they're still around in one form or another, and even though they're not actively making records the way they were for Sony, their legacy is still out there and it lives on. And I was thinking about this particularly in association with this chunk of plastic. This is the Amadeus Quartet box on Deutsche Grammophon, which I did a video about. You know, it's very, very good. The Amadeus Quartet, while they were active, was certainly one of the world's great quartets. For a while, they may have been the most famous quartet. Who cares about them now? The answer, no one. Nobody at all, because all of their repertoire has been done before. They were not proprietarily associated with anything. There is no proprietary chamber music repertoire for anybody to be associated with, except maybe for a while there was like the Janacek and Smetana quartets with the Janacek and Smetana quartet. But then, of course, all these other Czech quartets popped up and did all the same music, and now even that repertoire is not proprietary. And I don't think that because chamber music is a subset of a subset, that is, it's a small group of aficionados who like it, that there is any wider public consciousness that would make a chamber music group sort of an instantly identifiable household word. You know, some groups have managed to eke out an existence in niches of the repertoire, like the Kronos Quartet doing contemporary music, but even they are already on the way out. I mean, they're starting to fade. It doesn't take long. It takes as long as the records stay in print. And if they come back, maybe some people who remember them will buy them. But basically, we're not talking about general public reputation type people. The other interesting group, though, I mean, besides from conductors, who we'll get to last, that really kind of strikes me is singers. There is one singer, and you know who it is, who had a reputation which has not dimmed and which remains as firmly ensconced in the firmament as anybody's, and that's Maria Callas. When Maria Callas's stuff started coming out on CDs, I'll never forget this because I was in college, sales of compact discs for EMI outstripped Universal for the first time like ever. Everyone went out and bought Callas on CD. It showed you the vitality and the collective group memory that people had for this particular artist. She was compelling because of the backstory, because of her marriage to Onassis, her loss of her voice, which was tragic, the idea of this frail creature dying for art. People tried to do the same thing in the UK with Kathleen Ferrier, who was kind of a dime store alto, lower pitched Callas. It doesn't work anywhere else, only there. But Callas was the one. And I was thinking about that particularly in association with, and you're in contrast to, this sucker, Pavarotti. I mean, who was more the face and voice of opera than Pavarotti? And who's talking about him now? I mean, even the three tenors seems to have disappeared. I haven't heard Nessun Dorma in weeks. I mean, heavens, what's going on? And this big chunk of stuff, this is all of his Decca recordings, the complete opera recordings. This is a lot of stuff. And you may recall, Decca actually began with a Pavarotti edition, one of those smaller album-sized boxes that volume 1 of the Pavarotti edition. Then they gave it up. They stopped. And they reissued everything in this giant chunko boxo, maybe deciding it wasn't worth the effort and time and money to do a edition in multiple volumes, and it was better to just do it all at once. So they did. So why does nobody care today about Pavarotti? I mean, he had a movie. He had Yes, Giorgio. I mean, he had everything. And it seems that it doesn't make any difference anymore. I think partly it's because, opera, like chamber music in its way, is a ghetto. It's a subset of a subset. But beyond that, he didn't have a compelling backstory like Maria Callas did, number one. Number two, operas tend to highlight sopranos as opposed to male voices. And number three, a lot of these complete operas were really specialty repertoire. For all Pavarotti's fame in doing Nessun Dorma in Turandot, which of course is gorgeous, he was a small-voiced lyrical tenor. He wasn't a heroic tenor, and he didn't do like Wagner, and he didn't do, a lot of the heftier voice things. He tried Verdi's Otello. It didn't work very well at all. And that was really, really the problem. So where he was really good was in the bel canto stuff, the Bellini and Donizetti and that crowd. And a lot of the repertoire that crowd did was obscure operas that nobody cares about. It's really that simple. So, and even his Verdi stuff, some of his Verdi stuff was, early Verdi, middle Verdi. It really was a situation where his voice at the end of the day was not going to be the most memorable one, however beautiful it was, and it was. But also, there wasn't a market for the repertoire that he really excelled in. And so now, Pavarotti, of course, is a name. People know who he was. He's the opera tenor. I mean, people recognize the name. They really do. But the recordings, all of this stuff, all the stuff in here, I see them waning. I see his reputation diminishing. I really do. We'll see what happens. So now let's talk about conductors a little bit. And let's talk about 3 different conductors. Let's talk about Karajan, Schulte, and Bernstein. I think that's a fun group because they were the big 3 triumvirate in the 70s and sort of, up until they started to die in the 80s. That was the big bunch. Schulte was the Grammy champion. He won more Grammys than anyone in the world. Does anybody care? No. Well, why? Because 90% of that stuff's out of print. Decca released a big Schulte Chicago box, but they didn't release the other Schulte stuff, which they really should. They did do a Schulte in London, I think they did, but they still haven't done all the early stuff or the Vienna Phil stuff, which would be really nice to have. And I think beyond that, Schulte was simply not, he didn't have the infrastructure to keep his name before the public in the same way that the other 2 did. Schulte was, while he was winning Grammys, a name to promote. But even while he was still alive, he was on the way out. I remember having a friend of mine, and this is, of course, all hearsay, so you can take it for what it's worth, but telling me that their greatest fear was that Schulte would live long enough to do Sibelius or Nielsen, because he was recording everything. And most of it was really pretty mediocre. It really was. And ultimately, quality tells. And there was no repertoire with which he was particularly associated. Yes, he did Bartók, for example, and he did Bartók very well, and he was Hungarian, so yeah, they pushed his Bartók. But first of all, Bartók is not Bach or Beethoven. He doesn't have that kind of following. Second of all, Reiner had done all of it with Chicago, too. And he did it at a time when there were so many recordings coming out by everybody doing everything that it didn't make much of a splash. Karajan is an even more interesting case because Karajan was the music director of Europe. He controlled everything, the Salzburg Festival, the Vienna State Opera, the Berlin Philharmonic, and he made more records than anybody else. There's 900 and something of them. I don't know, just a bazillion of them on Deutsche Grammophon alone. Never mind EMI, which has almost as many, and Decca, which has its little pile. Karajan was all over the place. But what's interesting to me about Karajan is that when he died, again, there was no infrastructure to continue to promote his work. Deutsche Grammophon issued the big Karajan box, which you saw me bench pressing, in my workout video. That's what it's good for. It's good for exercise. But he had no posthumous reputation, posthumous organization to promote his reputation. Let's put it that way. And Deutsche Grammophon right now was a bad horse to bet on because they are completely out to lunch. I mean, the stuff that they're doing is, in terms of serious commitment to classical music, forget about it. I mean, the only serious commitment they have to classical music is a back catalog. Their new stuff, well, once in a while, something comes out that's kind of interesting. I mean, they do, a half a dozen or a dozen maybe serious classical releases a year. But they used to, Karajan alone used to be the dozen serious classical releases a year, along with everybody else. And they had Bernstein and they had all these other people. So Karajan's posthumous reputation is declining. He is also dwindling rather substantially because once they release that big Karajan box, what else are they going to do? I'm really curious to see, how do they churn this catalog? What do they think that they're going to do to create additional appeal for, the Karajan brand? I don't see it. I really don't see it. But Bernstein is different. Bernstein established Amberson Productions, or whatever they're called. Amberson is, Bernstein means amber in German. So Amberson is Bernstein. And that organization, working in connection with Sony and I assume Universal also, but primarily Sony, has been extremely resourceful in promoting Bernstein's legacy. That is, they keep churning the catalog. We've had multiple editions of everything. We have little boxes and big boxes and miniature and medium and boxes of every kind. You've got the complete Bernstein recordings on Sony. Then you had his 100 remastered things. And then you had his essential things. And then you had Bernstein conducting Bernstein. And you've got, of course, Bernstein associated with specific repertoire, as Karajan was not. Bernstein is associated with Mahler, of course, who is the most popular composer around now. I've learned that after 2,000 videos. I mean, when I do something about Mahler, the traffic goes like that. It's remarkable. So Bernstein really sells the product. And that's really, really great. I mean, I think you could do, and you can't do better than Mahler. I mean, let's face it. I know some people don't like him that much, but that is irrelevant. Most people do. And most people have taken Bernstein's association with Mahler as one of the iconic cultural things in our modern musical life. And so Bernstein's reputation seems to me very, very much intact. Bernstein was also had a much wider range of activities, of course, as a composer, as a teacher, than Karajan or Schulte or any of those people. He was busier. He wrote West Side Story. I mean, he was such a polymath. And that, of course, has also preserved his reputation in many different ways, and it all adds up. So Bernstein's reputation is really going strong. Karajan and Schulte, not as much. Doesn't mean that they're like forgotten, but not as much, because the labels don't have the incentive in terms of sales and in terms of, cost benefit to promote them continuously. It doesn't mean boxes won't continue to come out and the back catalog won't continue to be churned along as it tends to be, but there isn't anything really fresh and new and interesting happening under those names, whereas Bernstein seems to keep finding stuff or reasons to reissue chunks and pieces and bits here and there. Very, very, very interesting phenomenon, and all of which, when we take it together, results in the following. What is a classical recording? Because what matters is the fact that these recordings remain available. And because they remain available, they become classics. Now, some classical recordings are the result of simply a popular and or critical, and usually a combination of both, a consensus about quality work. George Sell, for example. Sony releases those boxes, and people have long memories. Classical music people tend to be old and crotchety and interested in history and what they heard when they were little. And so they all bought Sell boxes, and they sold out right away. They sold out very, very well. Bruno Walter, interestingly enough, did not sell so well. Bruno Walter's range of repertoire was much, much smaller in terms of what he actually recorded. A lot of it was recorded later in his life, when he may have not been at the top of his form, although I think he was very good most of the time. His reputation was for Mozart and Beethoven and Mahler. Well, Bernstein had Mahler. Mozart and Beethoven have been sucked up by the period instrument people, and to the point where Walter's greatest work in those composers, and some of it is astonishingly great, is sneered at, disregarded, even though the performances are by any standard glorious and marvelous of their kind, of their type. So the classic recordings are going to be the ones that the record labels obviously see, worth keeping in print. I mean, now that there's streaming and digital downloads and you can get like everything, that computation may change. But the only thing that's really going to change is it's going to depend on what we as listeners know about. And that depends on what people like I say in my 2,000 videos and what the record labels choose to tell us. And at the moment, the record labels aren't telling us much of anything. Certainly not the major labels. They are, like I said, sort of like DG, kind of like doing classical music because it's just inertia. They don't know what else to do. Are they making a serious commitment, a serious effort? Are they marketing anything? Are they touting the greatness of their back catalogs? Are they trying to reinterest us in the genius of some of these artists who we don't know that well? No, not a bit. Barely at all. They don't have the funds, they don't have the interest, they don't have the support. Therefore, it's nothing but a scattershot community of people talking about the recordings that matter. And that is what is going to determine which recordings become the classic recordings, like it or not. And I think it's really very, very interesting, because you wind up in a situation where conductors who I think are often extremely mediocre wind up getting disproportionate attention because they have followings. Those followings can be either cult followings across national borders or nationalistic followings. For example, Claudio Abbado, who has, he's been practically deified in Italy. I don't know what those people know about music or about Claudio Abbado, but if Abbado did it, it must be great. Well, I think most of what he did, as you can see from my chats about Claudio Abbado, was rather not great. It was pretty average. Some of it was great, but as a comparison of, to artists like Karajan or Bernstein or, for consistency, no. But he has a following. So the artists who have the followings get promoted independently of the musical value of what they actually did. And that's something we need to watch out for. That's why I think criticism matters. Yay! Anyway, that is my sort of summary about reputations, how they are made, where they're going, what's doing in the industry, and what classic recordings will be going forward. And I just think this is really a fascinating topic, and I thank you very much for suggesting it to me, as I thank all of you for suggesting all of the other things that you've suggested to me. It's been quite a ride for the past 2.5 years, and I look forward to it continuing in the foreseeable future. I've always said, maybe I'll take a little bit of a break and do fewer videos every day now that I've hit 2,000, and then I usually wind up doing more. I'm not going to do more. I can't. I physically can't. This is about my maximum production, and I just am so grateful. The reason I've done it is because you've inspired me. You've all inspired me, and I love you all. So thank you so much for joining me on this merry ride, and let's keep the engine going. Keep on listening, my friends, and thank you for joining me. Here's to the next 2,000.